Hello, I'm Sarah Schmidt, and I'm going to be summarizing a chapter from The Psychology of Emotion in Restorative Practices, edited by Vernon C. Kelly and Margaret Thorsborne. Chapter 3 is called Being Emotional, Being Human, and is written by Lauren Abramson. The main ideas of this chapter are that human beings are born with a set of 9 innate effects. Community conferences, or CCs, allow a flow of emotions that causes positive change for victims, offenders, and supporters. Emotions should be felt, expressed, and listened to. And the last main idea that I found in this chapter was that conflicts can be resolved by allowing emotions to flow in a guided and safe environment. So the 9 innate effects, we've talked about these in restorative practice classes, and you've seen this chart if you've been taking restorative practice classes. But what they really focused on in this chapter is that the 9 effects can motivate human beings. There were 2 case studies that showed us that in chapter 3. They were community circles, and it really helped the offenders, the victims, and the supporters with figuring out what to do next in their situation, and everyone came out with a positive sense of being. But the 9 effects motivate human beings. The response to effect is emotion. So the effects you see here on this chart are actually the things that motivate emotion. 2 big ones that were discussed in chapter 3 were shame and disgust. Shame actually prompts a desire to reconnect. Disgust prompts rejection and avoidance. So that's where conflict usually comes in. So before we look at those, we're going to talk about community conferences. Community conferences are bringing victims, offenders, and supporters together to repair harm and restore bonds. So the facilitator guides participants through 3 questions. What happened? How have people been affected? And what can be done to repair the harm and prevent it from happening again? At some point during that conference, it's usually after everyone's talked about how they've been affected, everyone has a collective moment of vulnerability in which everyone awakens to a feeling of collective responsibility for what's happening. So now we can really take a closer look at the flow of emotions in a conference and how those things motivate us to do better and to restore some bonds or repair harm. So let's take a look at this. So the flow of emotion in community conferencing starts with entering the conference, introducing the participants. So at that point, emotions are motivating conflict. After everyone's introduced, we talk about what happened. We start to feel sadness, and the sadness kind of motivates connection. It's that affective resonance that's discussed earlier in this book. And everyone's feeling that. Everyone's starting to feel a little bit of sadness for the victim, for the offender, and that's making everyone want to work together. So it's motivating them to connect. Now, the next part of the conference is asking, how have others been affected? This is where some shame happens, but this shame motivates restoration. So it motivates people to want to do better, to restore these bonds, to actually make a change in their actions. But there's also an element of surprise in this. So surprise is one of the neutral effects that you would have seen on the chart that you saw earlier about the 9 effects. Sometimes we can feel surprise, and that sort of resets everyone's emotions. After all of that, after we have how others have been affected, the last question is what can be done to repair harm? Thinking about that, that's where they make the actual agreements. That's when they decide on what's going to happen next. And those times kind of prompt some feel-good emotions. So these feel-good emotions motivate them to want to continue making this change and want to uphold their agreements. Something else the author wanted to express in this chapter was that all emotions are important motivators. So participants should be allowed to express and feel emotions fully, but an important thing is they should also share and understand how others have been affected. So they need to know that others are feeling a similar way. So we've looked at conferencing, we've looked at the flow of emotions in a conference. Something that's super important the author wanted to point out is that emotions are essential. So emotions are what brings everyone together. They build relationships, they resolve conflict, and they bring communities together. A big part of those conferences I was talking about is community members. The supporters of the victims and the offenders, they come together and they work together for the same purpose. So all the information I got from the book was from chapter 3, Lauren Abramson's chapter. And the book is called The Psychology of Emotion Restorative Practice, How Affect Script Psychology Explains How and Why Restorative Practice Works. The chart that you saw in this presentation was from the IIRP. Thank you very much for watching.